246 years ago, a very, very important document was drafted, and copies were made, and they were sent out to be read to the population in every little farming town, every village, every city square, every place that they could think of to send all these many copies. And interestingly enough, some of those copies have survived. This is not one of them. Rats. But anyway, imagine yourself in that space with those people, hearing these words that was about to change not just their own lives, but the entire world. Nothing would be the same. There are certain moments in history that shake everything, reform everything downstream. And this is one of those moments. In Congress, get a grip, Dave. July 4th, 1776. In bold letters, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. You know a lot of these words, don't you? Try to let them rest in your heart fresh again. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That, whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its powers in such form as to seem to them what shall most likely affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object of evils, evinces a design to reduce them to utter, absolute despotism, it is the right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient suffering of these colonies, these states. And such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Yeah, we mentioned George III. But these words apply to us today, do they not? Now, the thing about this is the Declaration of Independence is not actually, in its essence, it is not actually a political statement. It is a theological statement. It is founded on a principle that God has created us and that God has made us equal and that God has given us certain human rights, not civil rights, human rights. That we're endowed by our Creator with these rights. And they are not to be alienated from us. They are not to be stolen from us. They are not to be taken away. And when they are stolen, when they are taken away, we begin to suffer under various degrees of tyranny. But this is a theological statement that encompasses politics. It is bigger than politics. Now, I've had a little bit of discomfort preparing this message. One, it's not expositional, and I was taught that you should preach one topical message a year and then go back to your study and get on your knees and beg God for forgiveness. Everything else should be expositional. But I think this morning, of all days on the calendar, this is a day when we begin to look at how the importance of the gospel and our presence in our communities should be impacting those lives around us. And that we have been muted long enough, and it's time that we take our just place among the powers of all other voices. We have been silent a very long time, and many, many souls have gone into darkness because we have been so quiet and so passive, which is not the children's ministry this morning. God bless them. So being a theological statement, I think a bit of background is important. The Declaration of Independence is steeped in what at the time was a fairly new movement. It was vibrant at the time. And probably some of you have heard of the Enlightenment. Started somewhere toward the end of the 1600s, depending on which scholar you're talking to and how you want to define it, because it was a movement that gathered more and more momentum. And it was basically over around 1790 or maybe 1810 when that movement shifted. But what we often do is we lump it all together into a single Enlightenment. It was not. It was at least two and probably three. The French Enlightenment, the Continental Enlightenment, was one that threw off God and as many of the entrapments of the old society as they could. They dressed up a prostitute, put her on a dais, and carried her into Notre Dame and said, "This is reason, and this is our God." It was a completely different movement. It ended in the French Revolution. It ended in the Reign of Terror and Robespierre and tens of thousands of people going to the guillotine. Finally, Robespierre himself was, "You like the guillotine so much? Well, here you go." And they took him out. But they had to stop the bloodshed. Are you with me so far in this? But there was a second Enlightenment. They were talking to each other. They were separated by the English Channel, which in those days was quite the separation. But the philosophy of them was very, very different, because in the English Enlightenment, they never rejected God. They kept God in the forefront of their thinking. In fact, they were in the throes of the Wesleyan and the Baptist revivals. And this spread across into the New World, because the Americans at that point, the colonists who soon became quite ungrateful, the Americans at that point were actually the largest consumer of English books in the world at that point. We were voracious readers. I wish we could recapture that title. And so they were well educated, they were thinking deeply, they understood these things, but they never, ever, ever walked away from God. And so the English Enlightenment ended up in a constitutional monarchy, and it ended up in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It was the influence of the gospel on all of these real space-time history events and perspectives. It was the influence of the gospel that brought us to where they were, that they penned these words. Of the 54 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 29 of them had theological degrees. They weren't just pastors or religious leaning. These were serious followers of Jesus Christ. And so as you look between the lines of these words, we see the influence of the gospel and a biblical perspective if you bother to look deeply. It's there. It is so there. So with that establishment of this perspective, it separated us from the continent. It separated us to be an entirely different movement, that instead of trying to enshrine some humanistic concept, we tried to look at how has God made human beings in his image. How then do we create a society and a government to structure that society, to hold it in restraint, because, this is have you noticed this is not heaven? So government is necessary. It is, in fact, a necessary evil. George Washington said, government is not eloquence. I don't know if you've read Washington's letters. You should. He is brilliant. Anyway, he said, government is not eloquence. Government is not reason. Notice the reference to what the French were saying? It is force. He said, like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. So government needs to be restrained. And the perspective that they had in those days was we need to create a government that will enable people created in the image of God to best live out those attributes of the image of God in them. Are you with me so far? That was a lot of syllables. You okay with this? If you start to go numb, let me know, because you're gonna get the deep into the pool today. Okay? All right. So the idea that they were attempting to bring into concrete reality was, if people are endowed by their Creator with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which in those days was a buzz phrase for virtue, because it is a virtuous life that brings the most happiness, and this was assumed, and that was clearly understood on both sides of the Atlantic. And so these rights then were being established with a government not to force people to comply to the government's wishes, but rather so the government was going to comply to the best needs of the people, so they could be the most that they could be in Christ. That's what this is about. This is a profound experiment. The basic idea, and they understood this, if you would turn to Romans chapter 13. Romans, of course. Romans 13. We're going to cover a lot of verses today. I know that's new. Romans 13, verse 1 and 2. Where he says, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Don't let that slip by you. Every authority is established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive what? Just condemnation upon themselves. So every authority, every government, whether we like it or not, is established by God. It exists for His purposes, it exists for His reason, and we may not always understand what that is. But along those lines, there are people who have, and I've heard preachers that I at one time had quite a bit of respect for, that was a cheap shot, say that because we should be independent, or we should be dependent upon the government and submissive to the government, then we had no right to declare our independence and separate from the crown. That is an ignorant position at best. The history of the situation is, and I thought if we're going to talk about that, the government is established by God. We needed to clear this question up. The history is the colonies were set up as a cash cow, that's a fine theological term, a cash cow for the crown, for the British crown. And several kings were involved in that. Charles being one of them, Elizabeth I, I just think Virginia, because that's what they named it after, Virginia, after the Virgin Queen, which is probably not exactly true. But Everybody thought she was pretty. I'm not seeing it. But anyway, she could dress fine. But anyway, I'm losing it up here. Anyway, so the crown colonies were set up as a source of revenue for the crown. In particular, with the British Revolution, the English Revolution, and Parliament coming into its own, the crown wanted to have lots of money because, as you know, money very often is in fact power. And so they set these all up. Parliament was excluded. You hearing the problem brew now? Parliament was excluded from authority over those colonies. But when George III came along, he began to encourage, in fact, established Parliament. They were trying to get, pull more power away from the crown, and so they were trying to establish authority over the colonies. And they said, wait, this is not the charter. You're walking away from, in fact, how we were established as colonies. You with me here so far? And so you can't do this. You can't just have Parliament come in and take authority that they were never endowed with. Well, George said, not my problem. Do what they say. And so we had these colorful events like the Boston Tea Party and other things and pushing back and some military operations that should have been taking place. And so this uneasy tension that got worse and worse between the colonies and the crown. And even up to June of 1776, there was a delegation from the colonies in London appealing to the crown, please get Parliament off of our backs. We will submit to the crown. We will not submit to Parliament. Why? Because they were taxing them, they were billeting soldiers, and one of the arguments that came up about that time, a little bit before June, I'm not sure when that was, April or May or whatever, there was a serious discussion on the floor of Parliament whether the colonists were in fact citizens or subjects of the crown at all, that perhaps they were merely slaves. Can you see how people living in the colonies might have been a little disturbed by that? And then by the time the Declaration was signed and was being dispersed, there was a shooting war no farther away from Philadelphia than Fallon. You with me on this? So some very difficult decisions had to be made, but some very, very deep thoughts had to be made. So our independence was in fact legitimate because they walked away from their agreed structure of what the authority was. They abandoned it. Well, that's not what we signed up for. We came here in agreement with the crown to work in the colonies, and you're now abandoning a structure. You see why this is a problem? Well, then I guess we don't have to play anymore. Moulin Labe, come and take it. They tried. Didn't work out that well. But government is established by God. Our independence is legitimate. And as they framed these ideas, and were, in some ways, they weren't exactly making it up as they go along, but some of the frantic work that had to be done and the amazingly clear thinking that came out at the time, they began to understand some things, and they would talk about this. One of the things they understood was what has been called the triangle of freedom. Have you ever heard of that? This is a really interesting, almost chemistry sort of thing. And you have to have these three elements in order for there to be a system of government where we create the right kind of freedom and yet restraint on evil in society so that people can live out the image of God in their life and do that to the best. Is this heavy enough? Yeah, okay. Sorry, it's not going to get any lighter, folks. But the founders of our nation understood this principle. Only a self-governing people could be truly free. Well, in order to be a self-governing people and to be free, which is in fact an attribute of God, don't miss that. See, they weren't trying to throw off authority in some kind of libertarian or egalitarian sort of endeavor. This is what the French Enlightenment was, and this is what the libertarian movement here in our own country is trying to do, is just throw off authority. In fact, the globalists and the Marxists and the neo-Marxists, this is what their whole thing is. We're trying to throw off all authority. But in the process, they create chaos and lives are destroyed. But if you're rich enough and elite enough, you can be insulated from that. It's the other people who are paying for all of this, which is something Adam Smith talked about in his book, The Wealth of Nations. That it is that all of the elite stand on the backs of the people who actually do the work in a culture, in a society. And so in order for them to be free and to be able to fulfill the image of God to the best, then they have to have virtue. We don't use that word anymore. But it has to do basically with living a righteous life. You remember what righteousness is? Righteousness is not doing the right things and not doing the wrong things. Righteousness is a character quality where we are right with God and we reach out to others in what? Love and mercy. When a people is steeped in this idea that our behavior to be godly must be righteousness, where we walk with God and we reach out to others in love and mercy. This is what righteousness is. Good works come out of that, certainly. Impacting the culture and society come out of that, certainly. But if we understand that I am reaching out to others in love and mercy, then I will not cheat them. I will not lie to them. I will not do violence to them. And so now we have this sense of safety that descends and permeates into this culture. But we've lost this because we've turned to a libertarian point of view and we've embraced some very destructive French continental Enlightenment ideas which are bringing terrifying destruction on our culture. But it's not all bad. We're going to get to something that I'm going to call a springtime. Okay, so hang on here. So in order to be a free people, we have to have virtue. In order to have virtue, well, how do you know what virtue is? Well, you have to have faith. In order to have faith, you have to have some kind of openness and ability to make a real choice. I am choosing God. Now, I know there's probably some Calvinists among us that say, well, there's really no freedom in them. Come on, guys, give me a break here, because we know that if the Wesleyans, they're not Arminians, if the Wesleyans are the ones who push that it's all a choice, all they're trying to do is come up with some kind of certainty, and if on the other side we've got the Calvinists are saying that it's all God's will and you're in violation of God's sovereignty. And so he forces the gospel upon you. Either way, where do you end up? You end up in heaven. Either way. So somehow, free will, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. That is free will, right? But then there's also predestination in Romans 8 and other places. So those two things work together. They are not in conflict. So can we stop putting them in conflict? How they work together, we don't know. Do we have to know? Because I'm going to heaven. I don't know about you. I'm getting on the bus and I'm on my way with Jesus. Okay? Now. So we have to have a certain degree of liberty to be able to choose faith on our own without it being compelled upon us, or it's not real faith. It's a choice of the relationship. Well, to have that, then we have to be free. But to have free, we have to have virtue. To be virtue, we have to have faith. You see, you can't just have one without the other. Where do you start? Doesn't matter. You have to have all three. It's kind of like irreducible complexity. How many parts does it take to make a mousetrap? Well, you have to have all of them, even the little staple that holds it together, or it doesn't work. So in this case, you have all of the parts together, and now we can have this process where we have liberty, we have freedom. But we have to have all of them. Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. Exalt means to elevate, means to make bigger and better. It is to elevate, to make more important. Righteousness, you know what righteousness is? I know I'm compelled to say that every time, but at least you've memorized it now. You can probably mouth along with me. But righteousness exalts a nation. Having this as the character of the population, we are a populist country. having this as the nature of the population that reaches out to others in love and mercy, and is not first concerned about self, but how does my behavior impact other people? And I must treat them with honor and kindness and love because Jesus treats them with honor and kindness of love and offers them an opportunity to have life eternal. He died for them. Should we not value their welfare? This isn't turning out to be quite as political as I was afraid. But sin is a force that ensnares us. We touched on this earlier in the introduction this morning. It is possible because of verses like, first of all, we know this from our experience, but there are verses like Galatians 6:1. If a man is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, right? Look at yourselves lest you to be tempted. But we can be caught in a trespass. I see this in my office every week. I have Christians in my office weeping into their hands because they can't get away from porn, because they can't get away from greed, because they can't get away from their anger, because they can't get away from their depression, which in itself is not a sadness, but there's not a sin, but there are things in their lives that they don't realize are chaining them to behaviors and points of view that are crushing their lives. And if they could just... Have you ever seen a dog shake? First of all, wouldn't that feel so good? I mean, start with your face and work all the way down to the netherworld, and it all flies off your body, and you just kind of and canter off and live your life. There's this great video of this German Shepherd, big German Shepherd, beautiful dog, and it's walking by. I guess it did this every day. It would canter by this car wash. And you know the big brushes that are going at so it's leaning up against that, and it goes the other one, and it's just sopping wet, and it steps back and just shakes, and it flies off, and it just looks like, and it goes on about its day. Who knows where it's going? It's the funniest dog. I love dogs. They're so real. But wouldn't it be nice for that sin that you struggle with, that poisons so much of the rest of your days, that you could just go out in the yard and just shake that thing off and watch it drift over the grass and fertilize it, because that's all it's good for, and be free. Sin is a slavery. It's a slavery. We're enslaved to our anger, to our greed, to our lust, to our selfishness. What we're really busy doing is trying to cheat God out of His ability to provide for us. I'll let that one soak in. But this is exactly why forces that are hostile to God and His people, that hate Him, hate His word, hate His people, hate Him. Oh, they'll give it lip service. They'll give it lip service. But they hate God. Watch their actions. See what else they do. But this is why these forces hostile to God and His people have worked so hard to undermine our holiness. Have you ever heard of Balaam? Balaam's in the book of Numbers. And we think about Balaam and the talking donkey, The talking donkey is, he's amazing. He has a speaking part in the Bible. Wow. Now, that's a good animal. Okay? So we kind of get caught up in that, and we forget what Balaam was about. Balaam, to make a long story short, which is unique for me, to make a long story short, what he was called to do by Balak, is that the ugliest name you ever heard in your life? Balak. Hires him to curse Israel. So he tries that, it doesn't work, but he comes up with a second scheme. What he says is send the women into the camp of Israel and have them have sex with the men in the camp of Israel, but do it as worship to Baal. And then God will be angry with them and He will destroy Israel. Whoa. Can you think of something more cynical than that? But this is what Balaam was trying to do. And they caught up with him and they killed him later. He had it coming. Because of how many lives did he destroy with this amazingly cunning plan. But what we see in our culture is exactly the same thing. It comes from a different direction, but this is why we had the sexual revolution in the 60s. This is why we began to open this question again that even Thomas Jefferson at the time squashed, that the Constitution is an open document, meaning you interpret it as you will whenever you want to. And Jefferson himself said, when you draft a contract with somebody, that doesn't mean you get to go back and change the terms willy-nilly whenever you want to. Contract is contract. So it is not a living document that can be reinterpreted with every generation. It is a contract. We don't change the terms. Jefferson said that. He knew a thing or two about the Constitution. Would you agree? And the attitude of the people who framed it. And so what they've tried to do is open this up to all kinds of bizarre interpretations. And they have found rights and privileges that simply do not exist because they have exited the protective bubble of being with God and understanding that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. We have been slowly seduced into embracing ideas that are incredibly destructive to the people around us. Am I preaching politics? No. But if the gospel is real, and it involves real people in their real lives, then it will influence politics. Just as the Declaration of Independence is not so much a political document, it is a theological statement that encompasses politics. And this is the marvelous blend, the genius of the English Enlightenment, preserving their relationship with God with passion, and looking then, how do we create a society where that vision that God has given us of people can best be expressed. Look at John chapter 8. Picking up with verse 34. Actually, pick up verse 31. John 8:31. So Jesus was saying to those Jews, now remember, those are the ones who, that's what they labeled themselves. This is not some anti-Semitic thing. They wanted to be called the Jews because they're better than everybody else. That was the elitists here, okay? So Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed him, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine. And you will know the truth, you know the rest of it, and the truth make you free. Free from what? Sin. I'm afraid he's not talking about taxation without representation. He's talking about free from your sin. And he says, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. They answered him. Listen to the stodgy pomposity of this, okay? We are Abraham's descendants, and have never yet been enslaved to anyone. Excuse me? Why do you speak Aramaic then, and not Hebrew? Because that came from the Assyrians. Why is there a Roman garrison stationed in Jerusalem? Truly a dizzying intellect. So, we've never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free? Jesus answered and said, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is what? The slave does not. Now this commits is actually a participle. It means is committing sin, living in it. That's the idea. It's hard to translate that way, so they turned it. But it is continually committing this. It's a continuous sense verb. Everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. Do you hear the thunder on the horizon when he says this? The Son does remain forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. He's talking about setting them free from sin. And in a free society where we can worship and we can exercise virtue in keeping with what God calls us to do, then we have a far higher chance of expressing God's will in our life into the lives of real people around us. Does this make sense? This was the American experience. This was the experiment. Romans 6:7. Now you've heard me talk about how we have been crucified, buried, and raised with Christ, right? We've been soaking ourselves in this in Romans 6 and 7. So I won't go through all that. If you want some more, come back on Wednesday. But we have been crucified really concretely. This is not a figure of speech. I have been crucified with Christ. No longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. This is concrete reality. We have been crucified with Christ, buried with him, and raised to newness of life. And then he says in verse 7, he says that he who has died to sin is no longer slave. The whole process here, the whole idea I'm trying to get at here is that God has set us free from sin. Look at Colossians chapter 1. You thought I was going to take you to chapter 3, didn't you? We're going to chapter 1. I was kindly accused once of having certain go-to verses. Guilty. So, 1:13. For he, Jesus, rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. We've been pulled out of this kingdom of darkness, put into a new one that is free, because we have the redemption of sin. It's been cleansed away. Maybe you didn't get to shake it off and enjoy that moment, but the net effect is the same. But freedom is not just for self-gratification. Oh, so I'm free now. I can just run around and do whatever I want. The same kind of question is raised in Romans chapter 6. Shall we continue in sin that grace may increase? Or since we're no longer under the law, shall we just sin with abandon? Is that what he's saying? What a ghastly thought. Never think that. The translation of may it never be it's exactly what it says. Those are the words. But it should be more like, it's an idiom, and that's what that means. Shall we continue in sin that grace may increase? How shall we who died to sin still live in it? And then he goes on to say, what benefit did you get from the things which you are now ashamed of? Aren't you ashamed of those things that you did? That sometimes you still do? We're ashamed of those things. And why did we come to Christ in the first place? To get away from it. To escape the slavery. That's why that beautiful song, Free at Last, Free at Last. Thank God Almighty, I am free at last. Those are beautiful words. Now that may not be a verse, but songs go, maybe that's the closest thing it ought to have been a verse. It's a beautiful thing. But in Galatians chapter 5, look at Galatians. Remember, Galatians is one of the prison epistles, and there's a little clump of them. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. And it may be a little hard sometimes to keep track of that, but Gentiles eat pork chops, so you can keep track of it now. Okay? I won't give you the whole thing. It's just so fun. Maybe some other time. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, he says, it was for freedom that Christ set you free. Is he talking about so I can go vote? So I can say what I want and assemble? He's not talking about that. But that will grow out of it. Those things will and must grow out of it. It was for freedom that Christ set you free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to the yoke of slavery. What slavery is he talking about? Sin. Drop down. Look at verse 13. For You were called to freedom, brethren, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another. That's what your freedom is for, to serve one another. Isn't that an expression of righteousness? Being right with God and reaching out to others in love and mercy. This is so simple. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Wow. But if you bite and devour one another, take care lest you are consumed. To be free, we must have virtue. To be virtuous, we must have faith. To have genuine faith, we must be free. So freedom isn't just so we can go exercise. You've heard people talk about their Christian freedom. I'm free in Christ, I can do what I want to do. Yeah, well, I guess you can. But be very careful because God sees you. And Hebrews chapter 12 has some very stunning verses in there about He is, and this is the Dave Looser translation, that He is perfectly willing to pull you through a knothole to scrape your sorry, sinful pattern off your hide. So, do what you want. Come on back when you're done. But we seem to be in something of a thaw. Have you been paying attention to what's been coming out of the Supreme Court recently? Isn't this fascinating? Since the 1940s, our freedoms have been eroded by leftist activists who have come to dominate the courts, our legislatures, the media, and the universities. Why? Because they have a secular religion, and they have been imposing that on us. And I was just talking with Lyle, and I wish I'd had a longer conversation than we could have this morning, because he was pointing out about this in around 1923, that we decided as a church that we would be fortress Christians and we would pull away from secular society, and somehow that was an unclean thing that we were supposed to do. And yet 1 Corinthians says, I did not tell you to come out of the world. I told you not to be a part of the world. You have to be in the world. This is what the Great Commission is about, to reach people for Christ. And when we pull into a fortress mentality of our churches and we stop realizing we're going to have to impact the world, and yes, they will attack us, yes, they will. But we have to have the courage to realize Jesus died for me. I can take some risks. I can be embarrassed. I can spend some money. But since the 1940s, our freedoms have been eroded by these people, and public expression of our faith was persecuted under the fabricated excuse, and I mean fabricated, imagined excuse of separation of church and state. My son, who was a valedictorian, and he had almost twice as many credits as he needed to graduate. He did really well. But he wanted to say he was grateful to God, and to say at his speech at commencement, and say, God bless you. Well, some administrative do-gooder decided that that was violating separation of church and state, and he wasn't allowed to give a speech. So they decided to have no speeches. I'm still hacked off. The injustice of this. But why was the injustice? Because they were afraid that my son would mention Jesus. And they couldn't even tolerate him saying God. Unbelievable. But there's this high school football coach. Did you hear about this guy, Joe Kennedy? Hear about Joe Kennedy? Yes. Yes. Isn't that a perfect number? It's better than 40, but yeah, 40 days, 40 nights, 40 years. Anyway, Joe Kennedy wins in the Supreme Court 6-3. School officials now have the constitutional right to pray on campus and with their students. The Supreme Court ruled that preventing prayer is discrimination and infringement of religious expression. They decided that we have just as much right to public expression as those who are opposed to it. I know I invoke claps of thunder, but if this doesn't deserve one, I don't know what does. Because we have languished under this grind of we are not allowed to speak the name of God or Jesus Christ in the public. Well, we can't have you saying these things around the government stuff because that would be violation of the Establishment Clause, which says the exact opposite, that they cannot infringe our expression of what we believe in our faith. And they've told us to shut up long enough. But this artificially imposed separation of church and state just collapsed. Now, does that mean everything's going to be smooth sailing now and all these people are going to go, oh, well, we misunderstood, so have at it? Probably not. What's really fun is to watch Ben Shapiro, and he's watching the TikTokers. I don't even have a word for it, but it's obnoxious and really funny and heartbreakingly sad. The human debris that comes on and thinks they have something to say, and they simply embarrass themselves. It's tragic. But Christians in the public forum are no longer gagged by imagined principles conjured up from the outside of the Constitution, outside of the Declaration of Independence, or of the Bill of Rights. If they're coming for me, they can take me, but I'm not done yet. Okay? Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote in the court's opinion, quote, here, in this case of Joe Kennedy, a government entity sought to punish an individual for engaging in a brief, quiet, personal religious observance doubly protected by the free exercise and free speech clauses of the First Amendment. What he was doing was praying quietly after a game at the 50-yard line, and his ball players decided they want to go pray with him. He did not invite them. They came up. It got so bad that opposing players from the opposite team would come out and pray with them. And the coach that came up to light is the coach says, I think, the opposing coach, one of them 7 years ago, said, I think this is really a good thing. I like this. And the school officials started having kittens. Another special theological term. And so maybe it was a cow. But anyway, they got really upset and said, oh, you can't do this on school grounds and you're a school official. You can't go out there and pray. Oh, yes, he can. And the only meaningful Gorsuch continues, and the only meaningful justification of the government offered for its reprisal rested on a mistaken view that it had a duty to ferret out and suppress religious observances, even as it allows comparable secular speech. The Constitution neither mandates nor tolerates that kind of discrimination. That reasoning was misguided, he continues. The majority opinion said, both the free exercise and free speech clause of the First Amendment protect expressions like Mr. Kennedy's, nor does a proper understanding of the amendment's Establishment Clause require the government to single out private religious speech for special disfavor. Gorsuch stated that not just the Constitution, but, quote, the best of our traditions call for mutual respect and tolerance, not censorship and suppression for religious and non-religious views alike. The court's ruling also stated that there is a distinct reason for why speech like Kennedy's is protected by both the free speech and free exercise clauses, that, quote, that the First Amendment doubly protects religious speech is no accident. It is a natural outgrowth of the framers' distrust of government and government's attempt to regulate religion and suppress dissent, Gorsuch wrote. Bravo! Yeah. The gag on the voices of Christians just fell off. We can and must share the gospel with our friends and our neighbors and support those in the public arena who also share the gospel. Boil it down simple, witness for Christ. Now that some of the headwind has been reduced for us, some of the obstacles have been washed away, God is asking us to step up. Come out of our fortresses, come out of our little safe pockets, and share the gospel. This is what Jesus died for. Answered prayer for the voiceless. Proverbs 31. Try to get there quick. Verses 8 and 9. This is a verse that Leah pointed out. Open your mouth for the mute. We are supposed to speak up. We are supposed to take action. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth. Judge righteously and defend the rights of the afflicted and the needy. June 24th, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. 60 million children have been slaughtered. Thou shalt not kill. Why is abortion the cornerstone of liberalism and neo-Marxist belief? The Bible tells us to take every thought captive. It's not talking about just the stray thoughts that run through your synapses. What it's talking about is the philosophy of something. Like Plato's thought or Socrates' thought. It's talking about that. That's what he means by that word. Okay? And so we're going to attempt to take some of this captive. So here's part of what we're looking at. Marxist liberal doctrine insists that the world is made up of two kinds of people. There are two kinds of people in the world, those who divide the world into two kinds of people and those who do not. And they do. Marxist liberal doctrine insists that the world is made up of oppressors and the oppressed. It is an all-or-nothing binary model. Another way to put it is this is nonsense. But people have bought into it. And it's because of the intimidation and the way they have framed it to make it sound really plausible. And they frame it behind the idea of we're trying to set people who have been oppressed and abused and misused, we're trying to set them free so that they can have a full life. This is what they're offering on the surface. But F.A. Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom, he has this amazing statement where he said that ideas are like roads. They take you places. And sometimes when you start on a particular road, it seems like a good journey. But the farther you go along, you may find that you're ending up in some place that you did not want to go. This is one of those ideas. 100 million people died in the 20th century because of these ideas. This is not a good idea. But one of the chief sacrament of this is abortion. And why is that? Because families are viewed as oppressive. That if there's some kind of authority, whether it's a father or even a mother, but if it's a father or a patriarchy, you've heard that word, it's a pompous term, it was viewed as something to hold others down. And the idea then was to strip all of that out of society so there would be no oppression whatsoever. But at the same time, with their simplistic thinking, they have no idea what they're trying to create in its place. You can't have a vacuum and then go, do the best you can out there. People will attach to each other. We bond to each other. We organize ourselves. We need each other. So that's going to happen. You can't just strip everything away and then hope that out of the ashes something will rise out like a phoenix in some kind of glory. It's not going to happen. Government is a necessary evil. But families were viewed as oppression. So is gender now. So is property. And so they demand issues be framed in part of their binary thinking is that so you want to take this right, quote right, which doesn't exist, to abort a child, and so that means you're not for women's health. So you're against women. Excuse me? And we let them get away with this fast dance, fast talk, and say, proper response is, shut up, that's stupid. Because it is. But we want to be polite. Maybe it's time to stop being so polite. 60 million voices because we were polite. That's not okay. We pulled into our fortresses and we let them have their way. And so, borders, families, gender, money, even to the point of if you speak in proper grammar with proper syntax and vocabulary, that is somehow oppressive to other people who don't have the education to do so. Shut up. That's stupid. Okay, so they demand issues to be framed like this. So if you have a disagreement about how things ought to be done, well then you're against all these people. So this is binary thinking, all or nothing thinking. And abortion was used as an instrument to eliminate oppression against women. Because if they can't help being pregnant, then they are suppressed. They are oppressed. Are you with me on this? That was their thinking. And so Roe v. Wade was an attempt to force abortion upon people by outlawing any opposition. They were overconfident and they failed to set up abortion legislatively. But we did almost nothing about it. We didn't cry to God, at least not soon enough. But I think He may be in the process of healing our land, at least for a while. The oppressor and the oppressed. The problem part here is who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed? What about when the oppressed throws off the oppressor and subjugates them in return? Oh, no, that's not oppression, because once you're the downtrodden, you can be as abusive as you want to the other. Well, that's okay, it's justified. I'm not following the logic here, but this is what they say with a straight face. But the Bible is clear. How do you tell an oppressor from an oppressed? The Bible is clear. We sin against each other all the time. This is a violation of God's basic, of Jesus' chief commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you shall love your neighbors yourself. And Romans 13 says this is the fulfillment of everything. We just read those verses. This is what God is calling us to do. And so we can be both oppressor and oppressed at the same time. This binary thinking of Marxism is nonsense. Now, on this issue of abortion, the elephant in the room should be this. There are a lot of people that I've met that have had abortions. And they know the Christian community is opposed to this. And so they are afraid of us, and they think that we are going to condemn them and hurt them. Is it time to stop? And many have suffered heartbreaking grief after an abortion. We must not take upon ourselves to judge those. Where was that? Stopped. Anyway, okay. We must not take upon ourselves to judge those who have suffered an abortion. You don't know their story. I have met people who have been strong-armed by a partner into getting an abortion, and they didn't want anything to do with it. And they're heartbroken. There are men whose girlfriend got an abortion, and he's grieving the child he never knew. And he was threatened with, either you do this with me or we are through. Not a pleasant choice. But the individual stories of women and men affected by abortions are not easily sorted out, so it's not our place. The next part is much more difficult to argue, but I'll just touch on this. Self-defense. The Supreme Court just ruled that it's okay to constitutionally carry a firearm. Why? The long and the short of, yes, it's Constitution, but why? Because the biblical principle is that it's okay to defend yourself. It is not okay to set up some kind of vigilantism or to establish some kind of theological jihad. It is not about domination. It is about protecting ourselves. And in a populist government, I'll give you the short version, in a populist government, the government bears the sword, right, of capital punishment. But who in a populist society, ours, where does ultimate sovereignty reside? In the people. And so the framers, in their wisdom, left to some degree, at least some of the right to bear the sword in the hands of the people. We can bear a weapon to protect ourselves. In fact, Jesus was telling the guys, you need to just, when they were about to be arrested, and just like moments before, he said, don't carry too much stuff, go get a sword and get out of here. He told them to arm themselves. Did they? I'm not so sure. Maybe Peter did. Had them. Yeah, and they didn't have much to hear for that. Anyway. It's okay. It got glued back on. So, I've mentioned Jesus is a pretty good therapist. Not a bad plastic surgeon either. Anyway. And so, we have a right in Scripture. In Esther chapter 8, there was this law that had gone out from Ahasuerus, but you didn't know I could say that it had gone out that the Jews were going to be wiped out. Anti-Semitism is not a new thing. The Jews were going to be wiped out. Well, he couldn't wipe the law away, so what he had to do is come up with a new law, and he gave them the right to defend themselves. And they had the right to wipe out any army or force that came against them. No questions asked. And so they skated through that one just fine. We're not messing with those guys. They'll kill us. Whoa. We have the right to defend ourselves. In fact, we are to defend others. That is part of self-defense. It's part of loving our neighbor as ourselves. There's a verse in Exodus that talks about if a young woman who is in the field by herself and she is being raped and there is no one there for her to cry out to protect her. Do you hear the implication? And she is not to be held guilty. They stone him. Right. But the part of the verse is there's no one to hear her voice. We are to defend ourselves. We are to defend each other. This is biblical. It's okay. So what does this say to us about so many things? On this Independence Day, I believe we are in if not a thaw for liberty, we are in a full-blown springtime. I hope it is the latter. Winter may come again. But we are more free this month than we have been in a very long time. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your amazing word and for brilliant people that helped us understand things in the Bible we have never understood before. But they saw the practicality of it and made it work. We thank you for this time that we have. In Jesus' name, amen.